Chekhov never makes it easy for you. He, in his plays, in his short fiction, he always makes you work to figure out what exactly is going on. Because, quite frankly, on the surface, very often nothing is going on. It's very hard to really draw even a plot out of a lot of his work, but that's just on the surface. When you start to scratch at some of those little areas where he makes conspicuous, then you're starting to see a richness underneath that is remarkably dynamic. There's a lot more going on than meets the eye in anything that he writes. And part of that is intentional. He is part of this movement away from realism in the in the 18th century, or the 19th century rather, and he's moving on into early modernism, which is bringing things just a little bit more psychological to bear on it, a little bit more interior, addressing social problems, but doing it in a very personal and psychologically realistic way. Psychologically realistic in the way that is not realism as we know it. Realism generally is much more exterior, dealing with social problems, social issues. He deals with psychological issues, and he does that quite well in this this story here, titled "At Home." The original Russian is "Doma." He has a couple of stories that don't translate in their titles well, so it can be a little confusing. So he has another one that often gets confused with this, but this is the one with Evgeny Petrovich Bykovsky, the public prosecutor of the district court, who has just been told by his young son's governess that the young boy was caught smoking. He's apparently 7, and even in Russia at that time, even that's a little young for that. And the whole story is about how he receives this news and speaks to the young son about this and tries to scare him off of smoking, as you know any parent would. And on the surface, you could be flipping through the pages and again just saying, you know, okay, fine, who cares? What is going on here? It's a little kid who was caught doing something he shouldn't have, and his dad scolded him for it. This is nothing particularly exceptional. Why is there a story about this? Why am I reading a story about this? This isn't really doing anything for me. But that's the question that Chekhov wants you to ask. And once you start asking it, you can start saying, well, okay, maybe that's not the point. Maybe that's just what's going on the surface. But now let's start to dig underneath, and maybe we can find something a little bit more substantive, a little bit more literary, perhaps. And the way that I always go about that, honestly, is I look at the form. What is, if we're not given a flat out plot to latch onto right away, what other elements of a story or a work of art can you really dig into? If it doesn't give you one thing, take what it gives you and see what you can do with that. And here I would say it's giving us some elements of style that we can start to question. First of all, you know, begin at the beginning. Look at the beginnings and endings of everything, and focus that. Especially with a writer like Chekhov, who really focuses and makes his stories very, very tight. Beginnings and how he begins and where he begins and in what tone he begins. This is all significant. And here, in this translation by Hugh Alpin, someone came from the Grigorievs to fetch some book or other, but I said you weren't in. Who is this? Who is this speaking? I don't know. We're given an I said and you. So there are two individuals already that we're unsure of at this point, but we know that are at play on the drama. We don't know anything else. Well, I suppose, someone who came to fetch the book is also a player in the drama, but we're suddenly having to grapple with this, and pretty soon it becomes apparent that this person is giving a report to the boss, who has just come home, perhaps from work. She says, the postman brought the newspapers and 2 letters. By the way, Evgeny Petrovich, might I ask you to turn your attention to Seryoza? Today and the day before yesterday, I noticed he was smoking. Ah, there's the plot, if you want to call it that. When I started appealing to his conscience, he blocked up his ears as usual and broke into loud song to drown out my voice. So you get a sense of that, well, before you know anything more, you get the sense of, okay, maybe Seryoza, this appears to be a child. He is being tattled on of sorts here. We don't know exactly who this person is who's speaking, but you get the sense it is somebody who is responsible for his welfare in one way or the other, because this person confronted the child, and there was a little bit of a conflict there. Evgeny Petrovich Bykovsky, the public prosecutor for the district court, who had just returned from a session and was taking off his gloves in his study, looked at the governess reporting to him and laughed. So they're all right. Now we know who these 2 people are. This is a governess and this gentleman who is the head of the household, who has come home and is just home from the office, and he's being confronted with all the news of the day. And he doesn't seem particularly concerned. He's probably tired. He's got other things on his mind. And honestly, his reaction is just like most readers, like, oh, really? Okay. Seryoza smoking? He suggested. He shrugged his shoulders. I can just imagine that little shrimp with a cigarette. How old is he? It's almost amusing. Like, really? Probably looks stupid, but what are you gonna do? Kids today. How old is he? You can take that a couple of different ways. It could be just sort of like, referencing to the governors, an inside reference, like, how old is he? Come on, this is stupid for him. Other readers might come to that and say, well, maybe he doesn't know his child that well, and he's sincerely asking, how old is he? My experience as a parent, sometimes you forget the age, and, when you're distracted, you're scrambling for basic information, and it's, you got other things on your mind. Forgivable, I would say. 7, it might not be so serious now, but smoking at his age constitutes a harmful and bad habit, and bad habits should be eradicated from the very outset. Perfectly true. And where did he get the tobacco from? From inside your desk. Really? In that case, send him to me. In that case. He seems particularly upset right here that it wasn't so much that the kid was smoking, but that he was smoking something. He was smoking tobacco stolen from his father. He didn't care about it. It was just abstract, really, he's doing something. That's stupid. But yeah, but no, he took my stuff. That's when he's got a little skin in the game suddenly, and he's a little bit more concerned. And then we go into the governess leaves, apparently, after the governess had gone. Governess leaves, and Bykovsky just sits down and has a moment or two to collect his thoughts. And we get this interior monologue that sort of drifts around here and there. He remembers some of the frustrations he had as a young man when he first tried smoking and doing, sneaking that stuff around, that when he was a schoolboy. and uh, he doesn't seem to be particularly fond of those memories. He seems to be thinking in terms of he is siding more with the child in this case. Um, he remembers the injustice of it all. Such, no doubt, is the law of communal life. The more incomprehensible the evil, the more bitter and crude is the fight against it. And he recalls, like, kids would at their boarding school would get caught smoking, and they would be kicked out of school. And that's a black mark on your academic record or something, I guess. And this would have serious effects that would dog the kids for a long time. So he's talking about a disproportionate punishment, and he's following this little train of thought, and it's slowly getting more abstracted. He's remembering things very personally at first, but then it starts to become much more elevated in the academic sense. He starts taking a very analytical view of the whole thing. The prosecutor recalled 2 or 3 of those who had been expelled from in their subsequent lives and could not help thinking that the punishment very often does much greater evil than the crime itself. A living organism has the capacity to adapt quickly, to become accustomed and acclimatized to absolutely any atmosphere. Otherwise, a man would have to sense at every moment what an unreasonable substratum there was, not frequently that, and it is just going on. It's a very long sentence, but you can see he's taking that very personal little anecdote and he's building on it into a very vague and distant, abstract philosophical debate. Biological at one point, a living organism, where he's really he's not even talking about humanity anymore. He's getting lost in his own thoughts. And that's significant because, again, this is still pretty close to the beginning. He takes something that's very personal, very localized, and he is getting lost in these academic questions. That's curious. He sits there quietly. Similar thoughts, light and diffuse, such as enter only an exhausted brain, now relaxing, began drifting through Evgeny Petrovich's head. They turn up who knows where and why, don't stay in your head for long, and seem to creep over the surface. And now we're sort of objectifying his thought patterns themselves. First, we were caught inside his thought patterns, and now we're just sort of looking at them curiously. Or maybe he's looking at them curiously, and he's addressing himself in the third person. I'm not sure. It's a weird little place to be. But he's kind of lost, and he can hear people in their building, neighbors, making noise here and there. Upstairs, beyond the ceiling, on the second floor, someone was walking from corner to corner of the room, and higher still, on the third floor, 2 people were playing scales together. The person pacing, who, to judge by the nervous gait, was agonizing about something or else suffering from a toothache, and the monotonous scales imparted to the quiet of the evening something somnolent, conducive to idle thoughts. He's just sort of sitting there, not thinking about anything at this point. The thought has left him, it's drifted off into the ether, and he's just sort of, he's aware of his neighbors, but they are very distant, obviously, and he's not really sure what's going on. He can sit there, it's like, yeah, something's happening, I don't know what. That'll come back. The little boy comes in, and they begin this little interrogation, and it's really quite cute. But it's all kind of surface. He is playing a role. Hello, Papa, the little boy says in a soft voice, climbing into his father's knees and kissing him quickly on the neck. Did you send for me? excuse me, Sergei Evgenyich, replied the prosecutor, passing him by his first name, pushing him away. Before kissing, we need to have a talk, and a serious one. I'm cross with you, and I don't love you anymore. I mean it, my boy. I don't love you. You're no son of mine. No. First of all, that is kind of ridiculous. But he even says it that it's ridiculous because he says, okay, now before kissing, implies that, okay, we're going to get to the kissing, we're going to be hugging, we're going to be loving one another again. But first, I have to say that I am mad at you. So there's no sincerity there. There's no truth there. It's all a surface lie. And Seryoza looked at his father intently, then shifted his gaze to the desk and shrugged his shoulders. Whatever have I done to you? He asked, blinking his eyes in bewilderment. There is repeated reference to the boy's eyes throughout. This is a signal that it is more than just a little boy that we're talking about here. That the focus on the eyes suggests that, well, I'm sure he has lovely little eyes, but perhaps there is something more going on there. Maybe he is representing something. Maybe his eyes represent something. Maybe the fact that he sees and is watching represents something. But the repeated mention of the eyes suggests that there is something going on there. Because certainly the kid has other aspects you could talk about, but why always the eyes? Something's going on there. Not sure what. Have at it. They're talking. He's scolding them. He's having doubts inside. Again, we get more interior monologue. Yevgeny Petrovich adjusted Seryoza's collar and thought, what else should I say to him? And thought were in his thoughts. Yes, this is bad, he continued. I didn't expect this from you. Firstly, you have no right to take tobacco that doesn't belong to you. Everyone else has the right to make use only of his own property, and if he takes somebody else's, then he's a bad person. He's concerned with property, very specifically. Again, that's kind of what prompted his interest in the smoking to begin with, notion that his property was taken. So now it's become a property issue, not something with the kid's health or his supervision or anything like that. But it's just a question of property. He returns to that a couple of times throughout, so it's something to bear in mind. Something else is, something's going on there. And then in parentheses, I'm not saying the right things to him, thought Evgeny Petrovich. For example, Natalia Semyonova has a trunk full of dresses. It's her trunk, and we, that is to say, you and I, don't dare touch it since it's not ours. That's right, isn't it? The little Socratic method here, a little question and answer. He is interrogating his son, and after making his statement, he tries to get the witness on the record and says, that's right, isn't it? He's a prosecutor, he's a lawyer. He is trying to drag this out for the record and demonstrate the validity of his case. You have toy horses and pictures. I don't take them, do I? Again, getting them on the record, making them respond, making sure they're following along, but getting them on the record to lead them to a conclusion. Maybe I'd like to take them, but they're not mine. Are they? They're yours. Again, prosecutorial, depositional behavior for a father and son. It's a little weird. But also a real focus on and dwelling on the notion of property, individual, private property. My property, not yours. they they go back and forth. The father brings up an uncle who died of consumption, respiratory disease, essentially tuberculosis, and he was apparently a heavy smoker. He says, now, if he hadn't smoked so much, maybe he would still be alive today. It's a technique every parent uses eventually. Serioza gazed pensively at the lamp, touched the shade with his finger, and sighed. I'm sort of like fiddling around the edges, doing things that are distracting. We don't have that much access to his thoughts. Uncle Ignatiy was good at playing the violin. The Grigorievs have got his violin now. Again, ownership, property. It's not so much a question of whether he is still around to play it, but just where is his property? Seryoza leaned his elbows on the edge of the desk again and fell into thought. An expression froze on his face, on his pale face, as though he were listening intently, or else following the development of his own thoughts. Sorrow and something resembling fright appeared in his big, unblinking eyes. He was probably thinking about death now, which had so recently taken his mother and Aunt Ignatiy. No, it's Uncle Ignatiy. Right there where it's dropped very subtly that, his mother is dead, which is sad and leads to other dimensions in the story. But what I find significant in this little paragraph is that, again, we don't know what his thoughts are. We are given no access to them. We're brought into his father's thoughts, repeatedly, but he is just the eyes, the big, unblinking eyes. He is the face. He is impenetrable in a way. What shall I say to him, thought Evgeny Petrovich. He's not listening to me. He obviously doesn't consider either his misdemeanors or my arguments important. How can I make him understand? And he is frustrated. He has no access to this person. He can't make him understand. He can't make him see his logic. He is trying to appeal to him as a lawyer very logically, and he doesn't feel like he's getting through, almost as if they're speaking completely different languages. So he goes with before, in my day, these questions were decided wonderfully easily, he reflected to himself. The prosecutor again, the father. Any young lad found guilty of smoking was flogged. The faint-hearted and cowardly did indeed give up smoking, while after a thrashing, anyone who was a little braver and cleverer began carrying his tobacco inside the top of his boot and smoking in the shed. So again, he's sort of giving the wink-wink to the behavior, but he's saying that, well, it was very simple. The punishment was severe, was draconian, but there were ways to not get caught, and everything worked fine because of that. If you got caught, you had to be very harshly punished, but the chances that you were caught were easily minimized. He seems to be just saying, that was such a simple system. There was a rule. There was a vicious punishment for breaking that rule, but there were very easy ways to get around the rule to begin with. And I love that phrase, in my day. Whenever a character says, in my day, that means they're a little old-fashioned, they're a little out of step, and something bad is coming for them. And he starts dwelling on he starts going off on ways of coercing behavior. My mother used to bribe me not to smoke with money and sweets. Money and sweets. It sounds kind of like bread and circuses in the Roman in the Roman Empire. It was a simple thing. My mom didn't want me to smoke, so she would bribe me. There would be the rule once again, but we would find ways around the rule. And he goes from that and he abstracts it once again to adopting a position founded on logic. The modern pedagogue, which means teacher, tries to get a child to grasp good principles not out of fear, not out of a desire to stand out or receive an award, but with awareness. And he's starting to really get abstract again. And the notion of the pedagogue is sort of important because it's all about coercing behavior and working in a system, a well-established system for implementing that behavior and passing it on. The boy really isn't paying attention. He is sort of dwelling on his own little concerns. Talks about the cook cutting her finger in the kitchen. He's sort of ignoring his father. But after getting a promise that does not sound particularly sincere, Bukowski wondered, no, I'm a bad mentor. If some pedagogue or one of our court officers took a look inside my head right now, which is kind of what we're doing, took a look inside my head right now, they'd call me a wet rag and quite likely suspect me of trying to be too clever by far. But you know, in school or in court, all these tricky questions are decided much more easily than at home. At home. Remember the title, At Home. Here you're dealing with people you love madly, and love is demanding and complicates the question. If this little boy weren't my son, but my pupil or a defendant, I wouldn't be getting cold feet like this, and my thoughts wouldn't be getting scattered. ... He's getting lost, he's getting confused. He finds the immediacy of the problem, the personal aspect of the problem, really frustrating. He wants to, he would much rather deal in the abstract. He'd much rather deal in the academic, the evidence before him as a court officer or a jurist. But when it's personal, it's uncomfortable for him. He finds it hard to abstract into logic. From daily observation of his son, the prosecutor was convinced that children, like savages, have their own distinctive artistic views and demands which are beyond the comprehension of adults. Upon careful observation, Seryozha might seem abnormal to an adult. He found it admissible and reasonable to draw people taller than houses, and to convey with a pencil besides objects his sensations too. Admissible and reasonable. These are legal terms of evidence, and well, he's again trying to deal with this in a as a lawyer more than as a father. The conversation is really going nowhere. He is getting frustrated. And now kindly think of a punishment. No, how on earth are we trying to become less, are we to try and become educators? Again, sort of frustrated with his role in society, in the society of this family. People used to be straightforward. Again, back in my day, they thought less, and that's why they decided questions boldly. Whereas we think too much. We've been corroded by logic. Yeah, kind of. He is having trouble with logic right now. The more developed a man is, and the more he reflects and splits hairs, the more indecisive and tentative he is, and the greater timidity with which he sets about anything. Indeed, if you ponder on it a little more deeply, what boldness and belief in yourself you must have to undertake teaching, judging, composing a thick book. This is an attack on uh, the predicate of the Enlightenment, of logic and the belief in reasonableness above all else. And I particularly like, composing a thick book. Uh, the this character is so uncertain of how to proceed at a time, and he finds it incomprehensible that anyone would feel so strongly about one particular position, or one idea, one view, that they could compose a thick book in support of that when he can't really hold a straight thought for more than a minute or so. And of course, with this, I always think of composing a thick book. Well, who was he friends with? Whom did he know professionally? Saw as a colleague, perhaps, who composed thick books? Tolstoy. Tolstoy was a kind of a mentor to him, or at least somebody that he admired an awful lot. And Tolstoy was known for having very rigid ideas and being very firm in them, and certainly for composing many thick books. He is hardly a figure of the Enlightenment, but in this you can see in this, I think you can see a rejection not just of the Enlightenment, but in the whole belief in the whole confidence of reason and of having a single idea and putting it forth. But it's late, the clock rings, prosecutor says time for bed, say goodnight. And the boy asks for a story, and he says, all right, fine. On free evenings, Evgeny Petrovich was in the habit of telling Seryozha stories, just like the majority of businessmen and officials. He didn't know a single poem by heart, and he didn't remember a single story, so he had to improvise every time. He doesn't have that kind of creative mind. He's not necessarily poetical. Perhaps doesn't have much imagination. He usually began with the cliche, once upon a time in a land far, far away. Thereafter, he piled up all sorts of innocent nonsense. I love that. And as he was telling the beginning, had absolutely no idea what the middle or the ending would be. Scenes, characters, and situations were picked at random, impromptu, and the plot and moral emerged somehow of their own accord, independently of the storyteller's will. Which is a really interesting little characterization of storytelling. And I would say almost that it's one that Chekhov is citing almost approvingly. He doesn't seem to like here the deliberateness of a lot of art at the time. And he is importing or approving the importation of a little bit more chaos, a little bit less organization, a little bit less obvious structure to it. Scenes, characters, and situations were picked at random, impromptu, and the plot and moral emerged somehow of their own accord, independent of the storyteller's will. Well, that's this story. That's a lot of Chekhov's work, quite frankly, where it's not always clear what you're supposed to believe about it, what you're supposed to take from it. And it's oddly empowering for the reader to get to do that. Seryozha very much enjoyed such improvisations. He enjoyed it. So it works as a artistic enterprise, this kind of storytelling. Such improvisations, and the prosecutor noticed that the more modest and unelaborate the story turned out to be, the more powerful its impact upon the boy. Modest and unelaborate the plot turned out to be. Modest and unelaborate. that plot as you can possibly have. Once upon a time in a land far, far away, and he tells the story of an old czar. We are in late czarist Russia here, and this is very important. With a long gray beard and with this huge mustache. Well, first of all, he's an old and aged czar. Kind of repeating, he has a long beard and, well, and a mustache too. You're really scratching for anything at that point. He lived in a glass palace. Very significant. Google it. I'm not going into that right now. But it's a portrait of. Here we have a minor portrait of a very fancy palace from the Tsar that is a symbol, perhaps, of his greatness. And the story, as they have it after this image, which is just an image and it's just sort of left there, and then you can see the left-hand turn of the plot suddenly kicking in because Evgeny Petrovich had to think and continued. He just thought, oh yeah, I'm trying to make a point with this. I have a moral, I have a theme, I'm trying to correct a certain behavior here. And then he tells him about how, well, the Tsar had one son, and the son smoked, and so he died, and all of that stuff went nowhere because there was nobody to leave it to, and the whole society fell to hell. There was no one to govern the state or defend the palace. Enemies came, killed the man, destroyed the palace, and in the garden there now are no cherry trees, no birds, no little bells, and that's how it is, my boy. And that's the end of the story. And you can see, like, the very simple moral of don't smoke, it's bad for you. But underneath that ridiculous little parable is a story of social unrest. I mean, enemies came immediately just because this kid was smoking and died. The kid promises, I shan't smoke anymore. When he had said goodnight and gone off to bed, his father walked quietly from corner to corner of the room and smiled. And he feels better about himself. People might say that it was beauty, the artistic form, that made an impact here, he reflected. And that may be so, but it's no comfort. After all, that's not a genuine remedy. Why should morality and truth be presented not in raw form, but in additives, always without fail, in a sugared and gilded form like pills? It's abominable. Falsification, deception, conjuring tricks. He is denigrating his own effect or his own method in getting his son to stop this behavior. Medicine has to be sweet, the truth beautiful, and man has affected this silliness since the time of Adam. Though maybe it's all natural and that's the way it should be. In nature, there are plenty of expedient deceptions, illusions, ... drifting off. He's set to work, but for a long time idle domestic thoughts, domestic meaning at home, continued to drift through his head. Beyond the ceiling, the scales were no longer to be heard, but the second floor resident was still pacing from corner to corner of the room, which is an odd little detail, and that ends again in an ellipsis, ... And that is the end of the story. Well, beginnings and endings. Always consider, why is the ending there? That's sort of a weird detail. It was just something that was tossed in at the beginning, and it's still going on. What do I care? This guy is moving around. I heard that he was agitated or something, or the father thought, well, okay, I hear pacing. It sounds like somebody's agitated. Maybe it's somebody with a toothache or something like that. What is the big deal? Why do I care? And the image, the sound of the image is almost kind of haunting. Like, it's late at night at this point, and you hear footsteps. And it sounds a little creepy. There's something unfinished here. There's something that's still lurking beneath the surface. There's something bothersome. And this drives you back to where the story left off with the Tsar, quite frankly, that social unrest. And this is the point where you look and you find out right at the bottom that the story was written in 1887. And this is late Tsarist Russia. There was a lot of turmoil in Russia at that time. We are a good generation or two, depending on how you count them, away from the communist revolution. But Chekhov tracks that moment very minutely, and it's all beneath the surface. You have this very domestic, polite, bourgeois scene of a public official, a respected person, somebody with some money, upper middle class perhaps, and his, he's got to deal with this young child, and he has to deal with this child who is doing things that he doesn't want them to do, and he's trying to appeal to them through logic, and the kid doesn't respond to logic, and you try and appeal to that, and you're remembering that, well, back in my day, when somebody was disobeying us, we would just crack down on them and make the punishment so severe that they would never think of doing it again, unless they can get around the rule in some subterranean way so that we could all just go on peaceably about our lives. And there were no morals. There wasn't anything particularly upsetting about it. It's like, yeah, okay, fine, you did something wrong. You smoked a cigarette. We don't really care, just so long as the system can go along as it always has. That's what he's concerned with here. And that pacing back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, that creepy sound up in the middle of nowhere where he's just vaguely hearing it, that is the creep of social change coming at him. And this is in just about everything that Chekhov writes, and he writes a lot. But there is always that sense that something is shifting underneath the feet of these people. This society is in flux, and it just doesn't know it yet. There is something coming down the pike for these guys, and they're just starting to listen and say, all right, well, something's off. Something's not quite right. What? And all the dwelling on the Enlightenment and notions of romanticism, when he recalled the jurors who simply have to have a speech made to them, the public who assimilate history only through epic legends and historical novels, himself who would derive the meaning of life not from sermons and laws, but from fables, novels, poetry. This is romanticism, and this is somebody who gets swept up, not so much by the logic of an argument, but by the emotion of it, by the passions appealed to. And that is revolutionary fervor. That is him not agreeing with that at all, but it's coming, and he doesn't seem to understand it. And the problem with revolutionary fervor is it doesn't necessarily respond well to the kind of abstract logic that he's been practicing throughout. This drifting off into, distant and academic notions of something instead of dealing with the problem itself. Your kid smoked cigarettes. He did steal property. Property was a big thing for the communist revolution. That is the problem, but he gets lost in this abstract thought and says, well, no, we have to deal with this on the basis of these distant notions, and it's wrong. It's just not working. And he is speaking a completely different language than his unreadable son. He doesn't understand what is going on behind his kid's big blue eyes, or whatever color they are. And he's at a loss. He doesn't understand what's coming. but it's coming. And he can't abstract it because it's in his home, his doma. It's too personal for him to see. And maybe that is the even greater tragedy. Chekhov's a genius. Chekhov is a master. Chekhov designed much of what became 20th century fiction, but you got to give him a little bit of a break. You got to give him a little bit of extra attention. He doesn't make it easy for you. He doesn't just, you know, he doesn't show you a whiz bang plot that whips you off your feet. It's about moods, nuances, shifts in tone, and undercurrents of misunderstanding that will lead inevitably to tragedy. Whether you really know the context or not, you get the sense that every character in Chekhov, in one way or the other, is doomed.